Podcast 6, 1950s Rock and Roll. The overwhelming popularity of 1950s rock and roll in the mid-1950s astonished both record producers in the music industry, parents, and the musicians themselves. To understand 1950s rock and roll, we need to answer the following questions. Number one, what was the social climate of the 1950s? Who is this mainstream audience that rock and roll appealed to? Second, what is meant by mainstream music? We've seen this term come up in the textbook, and you've heard me talk a little bit about it. But I think that this will become very clear as we look at 1950s mainstream culture. Third, where do these 1950s rock and rollers come from? Fourth, who decided that this music deserved a chance to be successful? And then finally, what was the big music industry's reaction to this? And by that I mean RCA Victor and the other major recording companies. The 1950s socio-political climate has been studied, and it's very interesting. I'm going to cover a couple of the main points to consider here. First, Cold War threats and nuclear fears. During the 1950s, we began a stretch of time that we identify as the Cold War. During the Cold War, both the United States and the Soviet Union stockpiled nuclear weapons in the thousands. During the 1950s, America feared nuclear attack by Russia. Americans tried to defend themselves by building bomb shelters and purchasing survival gear that was available to them. Public buildings with basements were designated as fallout shelters. Schools and public buildings were fixed with air raid sirens to alert an impending nuclear attack. And children in school were taught to duck and cover. Go to the YouTube website now and look in 1950s mainstream rock and roll. You'll find the original duck and cover video where Bert the Turtle suffers a head injury by a threatening monkey. All of this produced a tremendous amount of fear amongst the American people. We also engaged in a space race with Russia, as cosmonaut Yuri Gagarin was the first human to get beyond the stratosphere. The successful launch of a satellite caused a tremendous amount of fear in Americans, as we feared that the Russians would be able to attack us not only from the ground but from space as well, or listen to our telephone recordings, or spy on our government. Without Europe as an arch nemesis, the United States turned its attention to communist Soviet Union. The Korean War spanned 1950 to 1953. During the Korean War, the United States and the United Nations supported South Korea. South Korea was at war with North Korea, who was being supported by Communist China and Communist Soviet Union. So the United States was indirectly involved in a war with the Soviet Union and with China. Harry Truman never called this a war, but rather a police action. How this all came about is Japan was occupying Korea, the Korean Peninsula, before World War II, and after their surrender, as part of conditions of their surrender, they had to give up the Korean Peninsula, and it was divided at what's called the 38th parallel, with United States now occupying South Korea and the Soviet Union occupying North Korea. North Korea never had free elections, and rather a communist government was established. In 1950, North Korea attacked South Korea, which was occupied by the U.S. And this was the first major conflict of many to come of this Cold War. Generally speaking, McCarthyism is the term we ascribe to the searching out of disloyalty amongst the American citizens or within the American government itself. In a 1950 address to the Republican Women's Club of Wheeling, West Virginia, Senator Joseph McCarthy is quoted saying, "I have here in my hand a list of 205, a list of names that were made known to the Secretary of State as being members of the Communist Party and who nevertheless are still working and shaping policy in the State Department." Americans became very fearful of communism on their own soil and disloyalty, and so people in prominent positions were frequently being called out and called into investigation. So the decade of the 1950s involves a lot of political turmoil with this Cold War and all of these things that are associated with mistrust and fear. Mainstream American culture up to the 1950s consists of white, middle, and upper class people. At this point, what we're really talking about is essentially the greatest generation, as Tom Brokaw called them. This generation would consist of people like my grandparents and their children, my parents. This group of people just fought one of the most horrific wars in human history. Hundreds and thousands of GIs came back from the war and got married, settled down, and started families. The city of Richfield was practically built in the 5 years after the war ended. And the houses, you'll notice, they all look alike. They're all single story. They have a garage, and they're all connected by wide boulevards. The reason why all these houses have garages, driveways, and wide boulevards is because the automobile was the primary mode of transportation for this generation of people. Communities were designed around the automobile. These communities we call now suburbs. The so-called inner ring suburbs, and just to keep it close to Normandale, this means Richfield, Crystal, Robbinsdale. These inner ring suburbs were largely built in the decades after the war. These GIs came back and were ready to go directly into the workforce because many of them had obtained skills in the Army or in the armed services. These new homes were equipped with modern amenities such as forced air furnaces, water heaters, washer and dryer units. They're designed to be self-contained. Once you come home, everything you need at home is all you need for your daily life, with the exception of groceries. Women were the primary caregivers to children, and they stayed home to take care of these children, to provide them a safe and sheltered upbringing. We're not here to be judgmental on whether or not this lifestyle was good for the country or not, but these are the facts on the ground, and this relates directly to the music. Now, if we go back and we listen to Patti Page and How Much Is That Doggy in the Window, you can really see that this example is a modicum of safety. There is nothing wrong with this video. There's nothing to complain about other than the fact that it seems very sterile and almost trite, perhaps. We can identify the lyrics as telling this story of a man who is constantly traveling because of business. This is a highly esteemed type of work, an executive perhaps, or even a salesman. And she's looking for a dog to keep her company while he's off and away. It's a perfect example of what this music is all about. And if we listen to the instrumental accompaniment, it's orchestral. So this is really, this is really your father's music. I mean, this music is, it has the European Concert Music Orchestra as a instrumental accompaniment, and then it has relevant lyrics to the late 1950s white middle class and upper class lifestyles. It's also very important to note that because the American mainstream culture had disposable income, they could purchase items that aren't necessary, like television sets. And so television producers began to produce television programs that they felt mainstream Americans would like. These are television programs that are going to be very sanitary, a lot like the music that was being recorded for this generation as well. Go back to the video now and watch the clip of Leave It to Beaver. While this is in no way a scientific representation of what 1950s culture is about, it certainly offers us a prism, perhaps, with which we can examine this culture. Think about it this way. If a producer is going to produce a television program and do everything that goes into that in order to market it to an audience, they go through focus groups and they look at, what is this group most likely going to want to purchase or sit in front of for a half hour. And what they attempted to do in the 1950s is provide a reflection of oneself. And so therefore we get this very sterile, very safe Leave It to Beaver, and we can use that as a method of perhaps of understanding a little bit more about what this culture is about. The final point I'd like to make about mainstream America goes back to what I said earlier about families. Families with children. Children eventually get older and learn to command what perhaps might be an allowance or money that they acquire through odd jobs or jobs. And with this money, this disposable income, the children have a certain amount of latitude as to how they spend this money. This is an important lesson for every young person to encounter. So although these parents may have been upset with this music coming into the house, there's not much they could really do about it except complain, because of the fact that it was the lifestyle that these children grew up in that allowed them to have the disposable income to purchase the music that they wanted to purchase in the first place. And so that, in sum, is how rhythm and blues entered the homes of middle class and upper class white Americans in the 1950s. Where do these rock and roll and rhythm and blues musicians come from? Well, by and large, they came from modest upbringings. And by this I mean not mainstream America. One thread that runs through most of their biographies is that they enjoyed music that they sang in the church, whether that be black gospel music or white gospel music. These musicians enjoyed music that was played on the radio, such as country music and American popular music. These musicians enjoyed rhythm and blues. As we look at those genres, we come to the realization that these musicians just liked music and they didn't see a color line somehow in it. The next question is, who gave this music a chance? We've already identified that teenagers in the 1950s with disposable incomes in mainstream America purchased rhythm and blues records. So the first and foremost, record shop owners. So if we trace this back to how they got these records, we may begin to understand what the source of this investment is. Let's take Elvis as an example. Elvis was born in Tupelo, Mississippi in 1935. His parents, it was a very poor upbringing. They lived in a two-room house, and they eventually moved to Memphis, Tennessee in 1948. And in Memphis, Tennessee, Elvis was exposed to rhythm and blues. However, he enjoyed on the radio hearing popular and country music, and he was deeply connected to gospel music in the church. As a matter of fact, he would sing in all-night gospel jam sessions. However, in 1954, Elvis went to Sun Records in Memphis, Tennessee, where he met Sam Phillips. And Sam Phillips cut his demo record for him. And from there, the rest is history. Sam Phillips recognized that Elvis had a really unique style and sound. Elvis could take rhythm and blues tunes or country tunes or popular tunes, and the way that his approach to this music was different and unique. But my point here is that it took Sam Phillips to discover this talent. Sam Phillips and Sun Records is considered an independent record label. This is because this label exists independently and outside the big music industry with labels such as RCA Victor and Atlantic. So the first people to give this music a shot are independent record label producers. And this is because as a small independent record label, you have a lot more creative control over who you record and how you market it, because there's less at stake. This is true for a lot of startup companies because they have a certain amount of control over the kind of products they want to produce and the kind of products that they want to represent them. Now, Sam Phillips sold Elvis's recording contract to RCA Victor in 1955. By 1956, Elvis was known all over the world for his unique style. So this is interesting because Elvis is a cover artist, and the music that Elvis recorded was knew no color line. He recorded R&B, he recorded country numbers, and he blended his gospel sensibility with these other musics and created this new kind of hybrid sound. Now, if you want your record played on the radio, you have to get it into the hands of a DJ. DJ stands for disc jockey. Let's take Alan Freed as an example of a 1950s DJ and the effect that a DJ can have on music. Alan Freed was employed in Cleveland as a late night DJ, and he was playing largely big band jazz, mainstream music. And one day Leo Mintz, a local record shop owner, noticed that white teenagers were buying up rhythm and blues records. So Leo Mintz got smart, and he sponsored a radio program hosted by Alan Freed. Freed saw this as somewhat risky because he knows that rhythm and blues is a taboo music because it's by black musicians. And so he was a little hesitant, but it went over really well. And so he decided to take it to the next level, and he put on a concert called the Moondog Coronation Ball in 1952, where he staged rhythm and blues artists and sold tickets to anyone who could buy tickets. Well, who has money in the 1950s as disposable income? Teenagers. Freed's popularity carried him all the way to New York, where in 1954 he went on the air with WINS. In the July 1957 issue of Pageant, it's a teenager mainstream magazine, he used the word rock and roll to describe this music rather than rhythm and blues. He continued to put on these coronation balls all over the place, and they continue to rise in popularity. And eventually, we began to see the mixing of black teenagers and white teenagers over this music. On television, Freed successfully infuriated mainstream America by showing interracial dancing. And this is where Freed began his slow spiral downwards. ABC canceled his teenage dance television show. And in 1959, a House Subcommittee on Legislative Oversight that was doing the investigations on rigged quiz shows began to look at disc jockeys and payola. Payola means play for pay, which is illegal. It's something that was legal back in the early part of the 20th century, but became illegal when music was being played on the air as a recorded music. So basically how it works is you distribute the record to a DJ and then you pay them for excessive performance of that record. Because the record is on the radio, it becomes a hit and then people buy the records in the record store. So as a disc jockey, Alan Freed brought rhythm and blues to mainstream America in three ways. First of all, over the radio. Second of all, through live concerts. And third, through television. Now, ultimately, the large record producers like RCA Victor ended up having to take up this torch of rhythm and blues as well. However, what they did is they ended up buying contracts of white musicians like Elvis as an example. So as Elvis has taken rhythm and blues and through Sam Phillips eventually finds his way to RCA Victor, Elvis, being white, performing this rhythm and blues, all of a sudden seems like a decent compromise somehow. The music industry began offering artists like Pat Boone, who were cherry-picked because of their classic good looks. In recording cover tunes, the music industry changed the words to shape the song in such a way that there isn't as much or any sexual innuendo. They changed, in some cases, the instrumentation to include instruments like the violin or other instruments that one would expect to find in American popular music. Now, in hindsight, all that seems really quite awkward, and wouldn't have just been easier just to have Pat Boone make the decision on how the tune should be recorded and so forth. But that's not how the music industry works. This all does not bode so well for rhythm and blues artists, however, that do not belong to ASCAP, the American Society of Composers, Authors, and Publishers. This is a union that collects royalties for the use and performance of music that is written by its members. An example of this would be Arthur Crudup wrote the song That's All Right Mama, but we listen to this as an example of an Elvis Presley cover song. Now, because Crudup didn't belong to the union, he never saw any of the royalties, and he tried to sue in order to collect some of this money he probably had coming to him, but he died before anything was settled. Now go to the video website and look up two recordings. That's All Right Mama by Arthur Crudup and compare it to Elvis Presley's That's All Right Mama. Elvis recorded this song with Sam Phillips at Sun Records, but this is one of the songs that made Elvis a hit. And this is one of the songs that ultimately rose Elvis's stock value high enough to where RCA Victor became interested in purchasing his contract. However, I do find it ironic that Arthur Crudup recorded this for RCA in 1946, and it was released in 1949 as a 45 single. So now we can wrap this part of our 1950s discussion up. Barry Glasner, in his book Culture of Fear, describes America as being a culture that is thirsty for enemies and thirsty for reasons to be constantly vigilant. He says that Americans are always afraid of the wrong things. Americans feared communism. Americans feared nuclear war. Americans feared spying from space. But while fearing all of these things in the 1950s, a quiet thing happened, and that is rock and roll entered the homes of mainstream America through their children. The same children that they moved to the suburbs to protect from the kinds of experiences one might have in a dense urban area like Minneapolis. Ironically, mainstream America, while fearing all of these other outside things that never quite panned out, they didn't see this coming into their homes. The value of having a job, security, and money management is what allowed those children to develop the kind of disposable incomes they needed in order to purchase the kind of music they were interested in. Not the music of their parents, but rather rhythm and blues and rock and roll. We can't have this discussion without giving credit to the children of this generation because of the fact that they enjoyed music and didn't see the color line associated with it. And this is part of the success of rock music in the 1950s. This is one way that this generation's children split differences with their parents and rebelled. They rebelled by following their instincts and enjoying the music that they like, regardless of who made the music in the first place or what color they are. This is a radical shift away from the paradigm that had established itself through the music industry and through American culture in general. And the music industry, as well as business, adjusted accordingly as they do in a market economy. Although the Greatest Generation fought and defeated Hitler, they were not prepared to fight and defeat racism on their home soil, which is what this is really about. Stephen Kovac describes black swagger as what parents were really in fear of, that through this music, their mainstream children would adopt things that they believed were true about African American people. And we find out that these things are only stereotypes. And that is what they truly feared. Our next step is to listen to music and start absorbing the sounds of 1950s rhythm, blues, and rock and roll. Podcast 6, Part 2 will begin with this.